learn how to.
Special thank you to Steve Turner, who is sponsoring our program this morning, and we really appreciate your concern and your presence in the shul. And we also want to say Mazel Tov yet again for your upcoming wedding, God willing, in October.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We are really honored to have Amir Tibon and Thair Abu Ras with us this morning, two true experts on the situation in Israel. And I'm very proud that we can have conversations like this that are so important in this moment in time. So let me just introduce you to our two panelists, and then we'll begin. Amir Tibon is a senior editor and writer at Haaretz newspaper from 2016 to 2020. He was the paper's Washington correspondent covering the White House, Congress, and the U.S. Jewish community. Amir's writing on Israel and the Middle East has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Foreign Affairs, and other leading U.S. publications. His first book, a biography of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, came out in 2017. Amir currently lives in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, the closest place in Israel to Gaza, with his wife and daughter. And we welcome you, Amir, and thank you for making the time for us. We're also very honored that Amir has invited a good friend, Thair Abu Ras, to be with us. Thair is a PhD candidate at the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland and a fellow at the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland. Thair holds a master's degree from the University of Houston, a bachelor's degree from the University of Haifa. And for many years, Thair worked in both Israel's civil society and government, focusing on equal employment opportunities and political representation for the Arab community and the public sector in Israel. Thank you and welcome both. I'm going to begin with Amir, and then we're going to move to Thair, but I also want to take note of the fact that in the chat, I gave the link to a very fine article that Thair wrote last year on the Abraham Accords and how he felt that this had possibilities for real change in the Israel-Palestinian relationship, and I commend the article to you. So Amir, you are now an honorary member of our congregation. It's nice to see you. And the first question that I want to ask you is, are you and your family safe? This has been a pretty harrowing time.
Yeah, so good morning to everyone but me, basically, who, here in Israel, it's the beginning of the evening, but for you guys in Chicago, nice Sunday morning. And for Thair, my good friend in Washington, D.C., and I remember fondly those 11 a.m.s on Sunday in Washington. So I hope after this program, you're going to have a good time with the family. And thank you everyone for joining. And I'm sure with the Rabbi and with Thair, we're going to have a great discussion. And Rabbi, to your question, we are doing well. We are back at home in Nachal Oz. We were away for a few days when the missiles were landing and the bombings were happening and all that mess was taking place. Most of our community was emptied during the fighting. People went to other places, to relatives, because we're so close to Gaza. We don't have Iron Dome protection or anything like it that is relevant in this area. So a lot of people were encouraged to leave. And now that the ceasefire has been holding for more than 2 weeks, we are back. But honestly, we always have a bag packed for in case things heat up again. Usually we keep an eye on Jerusalem, because when the mess starts over there, we know that sooner or later it's going to reach Gaza. Last time, that's exactly what happened. We had, tensions in Jerusalem, specifically around the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, Sheikh Jarrah, the Old City, all of those very sensitive spots. And it seems like that's making a comeback right now. There were arrests today in Sheikh Jarrah of activists from the Palestinian community over there who are facing this eviction threat. And then there is a plan on Thursday, I think that is, for the flag march to take place again. This is this march of mostly right-wing religious organizations in the old city area that is in very high friction with the Palestinian population. And it was canceled last time because as it was supposed to start, Hamas began to fire rockets towards Jerusalem. But now they want to have it again this Thursday, and we are preparing for it. Here in Nachal Oz, we are ready. We have our bag packed. We hope that there won't be a new war and a new escalation, but we are, hope alone is not going to get you very far in this part of the world.
So the flag march is something that takes place on Yom Yerushalayim, and it is an expression of, let's call it Jewish Israel nationalism for that day, and an expression of the conquest of the land. It's a source of great tension, and the governmental authorities redirected the route. Normally it goes right through the Damascus Gate. So it's a really, it's a real statement in that, and the fact that there was a march, but they want the march that they want, and certainly they want to draw attention to it, is a powerful issue. But you've also had a loss in your family, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this is the war in Gaza. I think it was one thing, but something much more dangerous happened here in Israel during these weeks of fighting in Gaza. And I've spoken about this with you, Rabbi, and with Thair and with Amy, so I'll update everyone else who is not aware. But during the violence that happened in what we call in Israel, the mixed cities where Jews and Arabs, citizens of Israel, live together, there was an outburst of violence. And the one place where that was very, very strong was in Lod, which is a city right next to Ben Gurion Airport, 15 minutes from Tel Aviv. And there was one victim to the terrible violence over there, and that was Igal Yoshua, the uncle of my wife, Miri, who was a very good and kind and loving person, and never did harm to anyone. He was an electrician who worked in Lod. He had great relationships with Jews and Arabs in the city. We don't know yet what exactly happened. Initially, the police investigation said that there was a mob of Arab residents who threw stones at his car and then beat him to death. But since the event, it's been almost a month, they've had no arrests. They've brought the Shin Bet, which is like our FBI, the top security agency, into the investigation, and they've not found any leads so far. And currently, they are looking at two investigative leads. I would say the strong lead, if I had to put it in percentages, it's around 70 to 80%, is that he was killed by Arab residents in this method I described. And then the second lead, they're not ruling it out. It's the less likely lead, but they're also looking at is that he was killed by Jewish residents who mistakenly thought he was an Arab. And during these tense days, we saw terrible incidents of violence. Lod was one example. We had in Akko in the north where restaurants and hotels were burned. We had a case in Bat Yam, again, just south of Tel Aviv, where there was a mob of Jewish residents who almost killed an Arab person who was just riding his bicycle back home. We had in Jerusalem, a restaurant worker just endless, really, list of events of violence between Israeli citizens, Jews and Arabs. And for our family personally, it's just extremely heartbreaking because of the tragedy we suffered. I can tell you beyond the personal tragedy, I'm very concerned about this much more than the rockets from Gaza. Because the rockets from Gaza, at the end of the day, we will find ways to deal with it. It's difficult, it's tough, but we do have Iron Dome for large parts of the country, and there could be military ways to deal with it, and diplomatic avenues, and economic, and so many ideas. But when you have these almost civil war-like pictures inside your own country, inside your own cities, this is 10 times more dangerous, in my view, than the rockets from Gaza, because this is tearing apart our society from within.
So we're going to come back to the elections, but Thair,
I forgot about that.
yeah, right. Thair, first of all, how is your family doing in Israel, in the territories?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, Rabbi, and thank you for everybody for participating. And also thank you for giving me an opportunity to see Amir. Because of the pandemic, I was unable to see him when he was leaving Washington, so it's a good opportunity to see Amir as well. My family is doing okay. I actually come from an area which in Israel is known as the Triangle area, which is an Arab majority area about 30 minutes north of Tel Aviv. So not a lot happened. Actually, the only dramatic thing that happened was that for the first time we had rockets fall in our area, but a rocket fell about 3 kilometers to about 2 miles to the east of our town. So the sirens went off for the very first time in our town, and that was a big issue. But we were a little bit far away from the violence, luckily. I don't know about, the next time things happen, but for this time we were lucky.
What was it like for you watching this conflict in the United States? What was that experience like for you, and how did you see American coverage? How was that for you?
Well, I mean, it was very painful. I actually moved to the United States in the summer of 2014 during the last big war between Gaza and Israel. So it was actually pretty symbolic for me that, I left the country and still some of these problems, not only are they still there, but somehow they've become even stronger, or they've become more highlighted than they were in the past. So obviously, me and my wife, we just couldn't take our eyes off of our phones, talking to people, following the news. Obviously, this dimension of violence within Israel is what we focused on the most. Just like Amir said, the situation with Gaza is a very tragic one. It's one that we should definitely be talking about. But for us, the main issue was the violence inside Israel, in Lod, in Acre, in Bat Yam, in Haifa even, which relatively is supposed to be a city where, the social economic standards are a little bit better than other places. So that was kind of a surprise, things happened there. So it's this general feeling that, your roof is on fire, literally, as people would say, is what kind of captivated us. Regarding the American media, I must be honest with you, I wasn't following the American media as much. I know that when people follow American media, no matter what, they're going to be frustrated because they don't understand the nuances. They don't completely, every side is going to blame them that they're not being fair towards their sides. Today in our world, it's just much easier to follow, the outlets that you're used to. And in my case, that's mainly Hebrew outlets for what's going on in Israel, but also some Arab outlets from the Arab world, which also did not completely comprehend what was going on inside Israel. So really looking at the media was especially frustrating.
So let me carry this out a little bit more, Thair, because in the article that I put the link on in our chat, you're making the statement that the Palestinian issue serves as a legitimizing factor for Israeli-Arab cooperation, and the occupation remains an obstacle to accomplishing regional stability. You go on to say the Abraham Accords may intensify Israeli-Arab cooperation on the Palestinian issue, thus making the quest for a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian issue more central to Israel's regional foreign policies. Can you say a little bit more about this thesis? And now after the fighting in both, and certainly the fighting within communities, whether in Akko or in Haifa, around the country, and riding between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, do you still stand by this approach? Has this changed anything? Are you more hopeful, less hopeful? How do you feel about that?
Sure. No, I actually think that the events of the last month or so actually, restate for me the fact that, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really needs to be addressed if we are to ever move forward seriously in our region. My argument was that the peace between Israel and some of these Arab countries that are in the geographic periphery at the end of the day of our conflict, they're far away from, the ground zero of where everything is taking place, can be legitimized only through cooperation between these countries and Israel on the Palestinian issue. Now, there are differences between a country like Morocco that, while it's not exactly a democracy, it does have an independent or a semi-independent parliament, and therefore public opinion in a country like Morocco is somewhat important, as opposed to a country like the UAE, which has a population of about only 600,000 people, and it's a sheikhdom basically where the prince can pretty much make any decision he wants. So there is some kind of variation between the Arab countries, but the issue of Jerusalem in particular, and as Amir said, this was an issue that exploded eventually over Jerusalem. The fact that Jerusalem is still center stage, the fact that even after a peace agreement, people in the Emirates or in Morocco don't feel entirely comfortable to go up to the mosques and to the Temple Mount, is a fact that these governments will have to deal with when they deal with the state of Israel. I mean, just 2 or 3 days ago, the Emirati ambassador to Israel met with the head of the Torah Council of the Shas party, and it was covered in the media, especially in the Arab world. And one of the points that they focused on the most in the Emirati media, was interesting to look at it from an Emirati perspective, was that the ambassador met with that rabbi in particular because, as opposed to the religious Zionist rabbis, the rabbinical leadership of Shas, for example, is against Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount for theological reasons, as you all know. So it was very important for the Emirati ambassador to show his public back home, even though, again, the Emirates isn't exactly a democracy in any way, shape, or form, but still public opinion is important when it comes to the Palestinian conflict, when it comes to Jerusalem. And so it was important for him to make that point to his folks back home. So actually the events over the last 2 months kind of show us that this issue is still central, because there has been this thesis that particularly the prime minister, maybe the outgoing prime minister Netanyahu, has been, trying to, he's been trying to sell over the last few years that the Palestinian issue is no longer important. We can move on. We can have regional cooperation. The conflict came back to tell Netanyahu that actually this conflict is kind of central to the dynamics of stability in the region. And if we're not able to move forward with at least trying to solve it, even if temporarily, then it will come back to bite all of us in one way, shape, or form.
Just a quick note. According to Jewish law, there are serious questions about Jews going on the Temple Mount. The fear, of course, being that you might be walking on the Holy of Holies, right? I mean, that's that. So so there's some very serious issues here. So it's of interest that there was common ground there, and that's a powerful statement to a whole segment of the population in Israel about not going up there. But I want to come back to I want to come back to Amir for a minute, because, since the last time you spoke, nothing's really happened in Israel, really, right? The government is going through some major changes. So would you talk a little bit about what's happening in the coalition, and were you surprised with Bennett's choice to go back to Yair Lapid and to create this coalition, and with Ram, the Islamic Party? Was that surprising to you, and how do you understand it, and where are we right now?
Okay, I want to respond to that. I just very quickly want to respond to what Thair said about the regional and Netanyahu's theory on the Palestinians. I think Netanyahu was both right and wrong, and I'll explain. I think Netanyahu was right in the sense that we did get these normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco without a real peace agreement with the Palestinians, although it's true that Israel did pay some currency on the Palestinian front because Netanyahu had to give up the annexation idea, right? I mean, the return for the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, apart from weapon sales with the United States, was that Israel gave up the annexation idea. And this was important because, you know, between a right-wing Netanyahu-led government and a Trump administration in America, the settlers felt like this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to annex all the settlements, which I don't know when will come back again, because there's going to be change of power in Israel now. This new government that maybe will be formed is certainly not going to go forward with official annexation. And there's a new administration in Washington. So that's one point. And then I want to say where I agree with Thair and where I think Netanyahu was wrong is that even if Israel can make progress with the Arab world, regardless of the Palestinians, and I do think there is fatigue, and I don't think Thair will disagree with me, there is fatigue in the Arab leadership, at least, from the Palestinian lack of leadership, from the division between the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and their on and off fighting and disagreements. There is fatigue. At the end of the day, on the public opinion level, on the street level, like Thair described, once things explode, especially around Jerusalem, there is a very strong shift. And I think the reason Joe Biden, the US president, intervened after 11 days of fighting and put an end to this, I don't know if it's a war or an escalation, however you want to call it, I don't think it's because of American politics. There were a lot of interpretations that Biden did what he did because of pressure from the Democratic Party. I don't buy it at all. I don't think Biden, it's bad for him politically to stand up for Israel against Bernie Sanders and his part of the party. I think he actually, that's good for him politically. I think the reason Biden had to intervene was because in the last 4 days of this escalation, we saw huge demonstrations against the government in Jordan and thousands of Jordanians trying to literally break into Israel from the Jordanian border. We saw 2 cases of rocket launches into Israel from Lebanon, and also some unclear skirmish on the Syrian border of Israel. And we began to get uneasy messages from our new friends in the UAE, in other countries that are involved in the Abrahamic diplomacy, let's call it, that they have a problem with what's happening, that this is spilling into their politics. And I think that's why Biden intervened, because this round of fighting showed us that while we need to, I think, celebrate the progress that we as Israelis can have with other Arab countries in the region, and I don't think we need to give the Palestinian leadership, or again, you know, what I call the lack of leadership, a veto over progress between Israel and the Arab world. When there are tensions around Jerusalem, when there are pictures of bombs falling on Gaza and houses, you know, being destroyed, this still has meaning in the Arab world, and this can spill over very quickly into a regional escalation. And I think this is what Biden wanted to avert. Now to Israeli politics, Rabbi, I was surprised. Yes, I did not think this was going to happen. I will have to be honest and humble. I was pretty sure we're headed to a 5th election. Now, maybe we still are, because it's not guaranteed that this government will actually survive the very big test it is going to have in the Knesset, probably early next week, of the confidence vote, right? Because what basically happened? Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett were negotiating a government. Then this round of fighting in Gaza began, you know, coming from the violence that was already happening in Jerusalem and pretty much spilling into the entire country. And Bennett said, I'm withdrawing. No more negotiations with Lapid. No change government. I can't do this while there is violence in the streets and Arab citizens killing Jewish citizens and all of that stuff. Then the fighting was over. The ceasefire was reached. And a few days later, Bennett said, a 5th election is still very bad for Israel. Even though, you know, now the ceasefire is behind us, we shouldn't go to a 5th election. We need to pass a budget. We need to take care of the burning issues that this violence exposed within our country, in the Arab society, in the mixed cities, in parts of Jewish society as well. We are also not completely over COVID yet. It's true that COVID is you know, almost non-existent anymore in Israel as a disease, but the economic damage that it caused to us, the long COVID of the economy, is still felt very strongly. And so all of these burning issues cannot wait for a 5th election. And then that's when Bennett renewed the negotiations with Lapid. And eventually they signed this agreement that was announced to President Rivlin on Wednesday to form a government, a very eclectic government, stretching all the way from Bennett's Yamina right-wing party to the Islamist list, Ra'am, what we call the United Arab List, and they will work together. And the most surprising thing to me, Rabbi, and then here I will end, is that Bennett gave an interview. I don't remember when it was. You know, everything is mixing. Maybe on Thursday, maybe on yeah, I think it was on Thursday. He gave a first interview since he decided to go into this political pact. And he was asked specifically about going together with Mansoor Abbas, the leader of the Islamist party. And who, listen, without him, there is no government. This thing does not have a majority in the Knesset without Mansoor Abbas and his 4 members of Knesset. And Bennett was asked about the partnership with Abbas because in the past, Bennett had called Abbas a terror supporter and someone who doesn't recognize Israel. And Bennett said, I was wrong. I take it back. When I actually spoke to him, when I didn't just look at him through the media interpretations or partial quotes of things he said, I met a man who denounces terrorism and is looking for partnership in Israeli society. And that to me was the most, because Bennett could have said, I don't like the guy, but you know, we can't have a 5th election and we only need him for 1 vote, the confidence vote to form the government. And after that, we'll never hear about him again, which is something that some not so smart centrist and left-wing Israeli politicians have said in the past about Arab political parties. Basically, when they were criticized from the right for offering partnerships with the Arab parties to form governments, they would say, we only need them for 1 vote, and then we'll never going to hear about them again. And of course, this is very patronizing and insulting, and you know, nobody wants to be part of that kind of arrangement. And Bennett said, no, I spoke to the guy. He made a good impression on me. He surprised me. What he demands is completely within the realm of social, economic, civil issues. It doesn't have to do with the broader outlook of the conflict. Because again, this government, that's not the mandate the government has. Bennett is also coming into this government knowing that his party is not going to do annexation, okay? And I think that was the most surprising issue, that he decided to go forward and defend this decision.
So, Thair, I'm going to ask you the same question, but about Mansoor Abbas. That in the midst of, or in the wake of the outbreak of fighting both with Hamas and internally, were you surprised that Mansoor Abbas was still willing to go into this coalition? And how do you understand him in this situation?
No, actually, I was not surprised, and it was very clear for those that follow the nuances of politics in Israel in general and Arab politics in Israel in particular. His behavior throughout the events, particularly the violence in the mixed cities, was clear that he's not giving up on joining a government. It was clear somebody had talked to him. I'm guessing it's going to be from Naftali Bennett's side, who told him, look, all eyes are on you. The way you behave during this time will influence my ability to maneuver and be able to make a deal with you or not. So, for example, Mansoor Abbas, I mean, the truth is all Arab leadership came out against the violence from the Arab side, but Mansoor Abbas came out in a much stronger stance. He actually visited Lod in the middle of the events. There was one synagogue that was burned during the events there. He visited that synagogue, but he visited it with the mayor of Lod, who's a very hated person amongst the Arab population in Lod. His name is Revivo. He's seen as a racist member of the Likud party. And all of a sudden, you have Mansoor Abbas standing with him inside the synagogue, basically. Mansoor Abbas saying how ashamed he is of what exactly had happened, that this goes not only against human decency, but also against Islamic morality and whatnot. And anybody who's sensitive to the ear understood that he was not only talking to the Jewish population of Lod, but he was also talking to the right-wing leadership in Israel, particularly to Naftali Bennett. Because Naftali Bennett, at the end of the day, needs an excuse to make any kind of deal with Mansoor Abbas. And Mansoor Abbas kind of passed the litmus test, if one could be able to say so, with the events in Lod. The fact that he joined the government, it might have been surprising that he joined the Naftali Bennett government. It would have been much more normal for him to join a government that is led by Yair Lapid, by a centrist. But But per se, joining a government was not surprising. Anybody who follows opinion polls in the Arab community sees it's quite clear. There's a clear majority in the Arab community that supports joining governments. The politics that the Arab leadership in Israel has led for the last 30, 40 years, which I guess you can call the politics of pride, which is basically, to get up in the Knesset assembly, talk about what a horrible place Israel is, while not doing anything about it or having the ability to change anything, because in the Israeli political culture, if you want to get things to move, you need to be part of a coalition. Nothing really happens from being a member of the opposition. And these parties the Arab parties have always been members only of the opposition. So there has been this demand. It's not new, but it's grown over the last few years of joining an Israeli coalition, of becoming part of the government, being able to bring home budgets and other, what I guess we in political science would call goodies or pork, if you wish, even though in Israel, obviously, we don't call it pork. The big surprise really was the fact that he joined a right-wing government, but it was actually legitimized by two things. First of all, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, because it's important to remember, it was actually Netanyahu who began courting, so to speak, the Ra'am party, the Arab Unity Party. So if Netanyahu, the right-wing king, is able to do it, why can't Naftali Bennett also do it, right? So that was one thing. But also the whole saga that happened with Benny Gantz last year. So for those of you that don't follow Israeli politics, in March of 2020, Benny Gantz, leader of the then centrist Blue and White Party, had the option to form a government with the Arab parties. The Arab parties had 15 seats in parliament, massive achievement. And he could have had an easy 62-seat government with them. But he decided not to go for it because there was a lot of pressure from within his party, rather to go to Yahoo, rather than have a government that's dependent on Arab votes. So that led to a huge disappointment in the Arab community, and it proved to many people that with Arabs, there is no real difference between the center left and the right wing in Israel. They all hate us equally, to use an expression that was said time and again after March 2020. So,
excuse me for 1 second, Thair. If you're driving a car right now, could you please mute yourself? As much as we want to listen to the traffic noise, please mute yourself. Thank you.
See, there's a few people who are not muted, so please do.
Right. So if you everyone can mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you.
So yeah. So for many people, after what happened in March 2020, the whole idea of cooperating with the right wing in Israel all of a sudden became much more legitimate, because the left wing, the center left, have kind of proved itself that there is no real difference. They don't see any difference between us. The left wing and right wing in Israel do not see a difference between us. For them, we are all equally illegitimate as Arabs. So the fact that he cooperated or is now about to make a deal with a right-wing government or a far right-wing person in Naftali Bennett is somewhat surprising when you first think about it. But when you contextualize it, when you dive in a little bit deeper and you know the background of things, it makes a lot more sense.
But if you kind of look at this in context for a minute, there was a poll recently taken in regards to Hamas and Palestinians in the territories, where if there was an election held today, there would be a super majority of people in the Palestinian community who would be voting for Hamas, right, and vote out Abbas. And so you have that situation on the one hand, right? And you also have Hania of Hamas immediately the day after the ceasefire, claiming that the victory the victory that Hamas had achieved was to end any collaboration with Israel. So you have you have these two forces at the same time going on. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, how do you balance that? And let me just add to this in case I haven't made this question complicated enough. Where is Mahmoud Abbas in all this? And since you also wrote the book on this, Amir, I'd love to hear your input as well. So if you could talk about that for a second.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, Thair, I want you to start. Yeah, please.
Okay, very quickly. I mean, first of all, when it comes to election polls, I'm not saying not take them seriously. I think they are important, and there are actually a few good Palestinian pollsters like Khalil Shikaki and others. But the truth of the matter is that, trying to understand where people stand during times of wars isn't really helpful, because at the end of the day, war makes us more emotional, makes human beings in general more emotional. And there's this natural, I would say this natural feeling of wanting to support the person you feel that is defending you. So for many Palestinians following the war, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, all of a sudden they feel that it's actually Hamas who's defending them. So of course, they're gonna feel more affinity towards Hamas. However, if you go back to March, April, before everything happened and when the Palestinian elections were still supposed to take place, Hamas wasn't doing that great. The only reason that Hamas was first place in the polls was because Fatah was divided into 3 different political lists running in the Palestinian election. Mahmoud Abbas decided to not do the election basically because he was going to do very bad. And that has to do with Abbas. Abbas is very unpopular. He's seen as somebody who's in power. Palestinians see him as somebody who's in power only because he's imposed on them by the might of the Israeli military and by the financial support of the Gulf and the Western world, basically. But he's seen as a failure. His whole project of independence through diplomacy hasn't really worked. The number of settlers has grown during his tenure. At the same time, he was unable to defend his population. So he actually reminds me a lot of Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, basically, who's seen as Putin's pawn by his own population. Mahmoud Abbas, to a large extent, is seen as a pawn of the Israeli military, basically, in the West Bank. And it's not surprising that people have this feeling towards him. I do feel, however, if things go back to normal, Fatah is able to get rid of Mahmoud Abbas. At the end of the day, we have to remember Hamas has failed horribly when it comes to administration, dealing with the day-to-day lives of people in Gaza, and the Gazans are quite aware of that. I actually think Hamas will go back to its normal size of, maybe 25 to 30% of the Palestinian population. But I think there is a clear 60 to 70% of Palestinians who are not big fans of Hamas. But that's only my personal view. But Amir is the one who wrote the book, so he could probably say more.
Well, on this issue, I appreciate Thair's approach and thought very much. And I have to say, I agree with his analysis of Mahmoud Abbas's political standing. This is a man who was at the height of his legitimacy when he actually won an election. This was in 2005 after Arafat, and that was his high point at the time. He won a direct election to be the Palestinian president, won it fair and square. And at the time, he was seen as a new and hopeful face because Arafat's way led the Palestinian people to a disaster, which is the Second Intifada. It was also a disaster for Israel. And we can argue, we can do a whole session just with the 3 of us about what caused the Second Intifada and why it started and why it was so terrible. But I think we'll all agree that Arafat had an important role to play, to say the least. And so Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, it's important these days to keep saying Mansoor Abbas and Mahmoud Abbas, because for people who follow the news casually, these are 2 pretty important players. But Mahmoud Abbas, back at the time, I think one of the reasons that he won that election, that he rose to power, was because he was against the violent aspects of the Second Intifada, and he was known to warn against the suicide bombings inside Israel, and said that this will bring a disaster upon the Palestinian people. And so when he won the election, there was an approach that said, let's try his way. Arafat's way, we saw, 5 years of just a disaster. Let's try a different way. Let's try the way of negotiations, of international legitimacy, of a president who will be welcome in the White House, right? Because the Bush administration boycotted Arafat. And it was not just Bush. Clinton, who had a lot of interactions with Arafat, advised Bush not to work with him because he said, this guy lied to me, you don't want to talk to him. And suddenly there's a Palestinian leader who is welcome in Washington, D.C., and the Bush administration was, spoke very highly of Mahmoud Abbas when he took power. And he met with Sharon and then with Olmert and negotiated with them in Israel. And so there was an approach that said, let's try his way now, because of the other way failed. And for many reasons, and we don't have enough time to cover all of them, but for many reasons, that approach failed in the eyes of the Palestinian people.
And yet, but yet, the Biden administration seems to be putting a lot of stock into Mahmoud Abbas right now. That's at least what Blinken was saying.
I want to separate between Mahmoud Abbas as a national leader who can have a peace agreement with Israel and Mahmoud Abbas as basically a caretaker, a leader of the city and Ramallah and its environment, because this is what he is today. It's true that under his leadership, although the negotiation project has been a complete failure and there's been no progress towards a Palestinian state, and I think the Abraham Accords were his biggest failure in a sense, because it meant that the Palestinians even lost the ability to withhold Israeli normalization with the rest of the Arab world. What I do give him a lot of credit for in the book and whenever I speak about him is that under his leadership, the issue of security coordination between Israel and the Palestinian forces in the West Bank has continued, intelligence cooperation, but this is something that I give him credit for, and many Palestinians disdain him for, because they view that as collaboration with the occupation. They view that as giving service to Israel. Now, I think the picture is more complicated. I think that this coordination between his security and intelligence forces and the Israeli side, it also serves to save Palestinian lives and to stop the situation from getting out of stability in the West Bank. But I understand the Palestinian perspective that says there is no hope in negotiations, there is no movement towards our own state, and at the same time that we see Israel attacking in Gaza, and we see what's happening in Jerusalem, and the settlements are expanding. At the same time, we are also cooperating and collaborating with the Israeli military, with the occupying force. So he's very unpopular for that reason. I personally think, and this is just an opinion now, anyone can offer a different one. I personally think that the issue of coordination with Israel and security collaboration could become more popular, or at least less harmful politically, if it was connected to progress on the diplomatic front. In other words, if Mahmoud Abbas could turn to his people and say, the reason I do this, the reason that whenever an Israeli accidentally wanders into a Palestinian-controlled village or town, my own security forces will take that Israeli, and this happens dozens of times every year. And his own security forces will accompany that Israeli out of the village or town and bring them safely to the IDF, is because this is something that serves our interests. We don't want there to be violence. We are making progress. Things are getting better. A lot of Palestinians are angry at this because they remember the Gilad Shalit.
No, that's not.
Excuse me, again, can you please mute yourself? I'm sorry.
For a lot of Palestinians, there is the memory of the Gilad Shalit affair 10 years ago, right? An Israeli soldier was released by Hamas from captivity after 5 years, and Israel in return released more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Every one of those Israelis that accidentally wanders into a Palestinian town or village and is rescued by the security forces under Mahmoud Abbas's command is a potential Gilad Shalit, is a potential 1,000 prisoners. So there is a lot of anger towards him on the same issue that I praise him for. And I also have to say he's a very old man, and I am very encouraging of people doing great things at any age and dealing with challenges and obstacles. But maybe being the leader of the Palestinian people at the age of 85 is a bit, it's time to move on. And there are things that are happening in the world today that he's just not connected to. Things that could be important for the Palestinians, by the way, as they try to advance their own objectives. And there's a different issue of what their objectives are. But, social media, how communications work in our world today. Who are the influencers? What are the important places to speak and have your voice heard at? He's not part of that. He belongs to an old world where the most important thing that he has to do every year is go and give a speech at the UN. And I think for all of those reasons, there is the fatigue with him. I do think, and I would love to hear if Thair has a different perspective, that if there was a charismatic leader for Fatah, for the Palestinian Authority, for that side of Palestinian politics, maybe Hamas would actually go down in its level of support. But when politics, you're always judged next to the alternative, right? People praise right now President Joe Biden for things that in the past were just considered normal simply because he came after Donald Trump. Like, for example, the whole issue of, the vaccines, or not saying that you need to inject bleach into your body to fight COVID. So I think that the Hamas popularity is also judged next to the alternative, Abbas.
Thair?
Yeah, no, I generally agree with Amir. I think the issue is not just a new charismatic leader. It's important to take into consideration the demographic dynamics of Palestinian society. Palestinian society is a very young society because, Palestinians tend to have a lot of kids, just like Israelis relatively. So the reality is, I think about over 70% of Palestinians today are people under the age of 40. So that's basically 70% of the population are people who either don't remember the first Intifada or barely remember it. So this is a totally different generation than, the one of the 50s and 60s, which was mainly led by refugees who wanted to come back, or, even by the leadership of the Second Intifada, which was mainly people who spent time in Israeli jail and during the First Intifada and therefore speak Hebrew, have an understanding of Israeli society. Today's generation of Palestinians is much different. It does not know Israel very well. It is not connected to the Palestinian diaspora as the older generations are. And therefore, what you really need in the Palestinian territories, in my opinion, is institutionalization. You need to build institutions. And that was actually something that Mahmoud Abbas started doing in the first few years of his tenure with Fayyad as his prime minister, what was called in the US as Fayyadism. And they actually, kind of encouraged the rest of the Arab world to learn from the Palestinians, believe it or not, back then. We're talking about 2007, 2008, 2009, which is basically state building institutions, kind of similar actually to what the Zionists did in the Yishuv throughout the 1930s and 1940s. That has totally evaporated. The Palestinian Authority today is a one-man show. Mahmoud Abbas has a bunch of, I have no other word than cronies around him, some who have business interests, some who dream of taking his position when that day comes. But there is no real attempt for state institution buildings. And I would argue that the Israeli government of the last 12 years has actually been supporting that tendency of the Palestinian Authority. It is interested in keeping the Palestinian Authority weak, unable to become stronger on the ground. What they want is the Israeli government wants a very strong Palestinian security force, but that's just about it. It doesn't want other strong Palestinian institutions. So what you need is not only a new leader, but you need a new changing the way of thinking, a whole new generation of Palestinians coming up in the West Bank, and also a change in the way that Israelis think, whether particularly the political leadership in Israel and the way it looks at the Palestinians in the West Bank. That also needs to change dramatically, in my opinion.
Right, and the complication there has a lot to do with Israelis feeling under siege, right? And kind of being less interested, especially now, especially with fighting in the streets. That Israelis are, I think, Amir, I don't think I'm overstating this, Israelis are shaken in some ways in this last round of fighting. And does that make Israelis less likely to be hopeful or even to want to make changes in policies that are now maybe backfiring on them?
The issue here, this is like a catch-22, Rabbi. This is the problem. When there is quiet on the Palestinian front, we don't really discuss it here in Israel. Israel, for the last 2 years, has been going through an internal political crisis that has very little to do with the occupation, Gaza, Palestinian state, yes or no, settlements, Eretz Israel, all of those big arguments that used to define our politics are not at the heart of this unprecedented crisis that we've been going through. No state budget, no stable government, election after election, prime minister on trial for corruption, attempts to weaken the Supreme Court. And so when there is no eruption of violence in the West Bank or in Gaza, or the worst, as I said, inside our country, we kind of tend to forget these problems. They don't dominate the discussion, they don't dominate the headlines. It's also, although as if some people try to just, forget they exist. And then there is no progress. There is no movement towards anything good, anything that will, improve the situation. For example, when there is a period of quiet with Gaza. So, if you live where I live, right on the border, you don't forget that Gaza exists because we see it every day and we hear it when there's anything that happens there, whether it's a wedding on the Palestinian neighborhood closest to the border, or it's Hamas training and shooting rockets into the sea to see how far they can reach inside Israel. We hear both. And I think that it's important for an Israeli government, when there is a ceasefire, when there is quiet in Gaza, to think about, okay, what are the steps we can do to try to improve the situation before the next eruption? And there are all kinds of ideas we can discuss. For example, the IDF has been advocating for several years now to give work permits to Palestinians in Gaza to come and work inside Israel. Of course, to do it under strict Israeli supervision and intelligence questioning, so that you don't bring in people who are terrorists. But if you bring in 50,000 people to work and bring a salary, the impact that has on the economy in Gaza, and the fact that it's not coming directly into the hands of Hamas, right? This is not Qatar bringing money to the hands of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of the Hamas military wing. This is people getting their own salary by work and interacting with Israelis. This is something that used to be very common, and it's been non-existent for, I would say, 20 years now. There is the idea of building a port for Gaza, not on the shoreline of Gaza, because again, that would just be used by Hamas, but for example, in northern Sinai, under Egyptian control and under Israeli intelligence supervision in cooperation with Egypt. And the military and intelligence relationship between Egypt and Israel is probably today the strongest it has ever been. That will serve as a gateway for people in Gaza, for imports and exports, and building an economy. But when there is no violence, when there is no fighting, we forget about these issues. They don't dominate the headline. This doesn't bring apart or bring together or bring down governments. And then when there is violence, of course, the impact is negative, because it doesn't remind us, oh, there's a problem, we need to fix it. It makes us naturally, humanely, obviously scared, angry, besieged, and that's the catch-22 that it's so difficult to get out of.
So let me just shift from this for a moment and talk about the violence, the potential violence in Israel regarding the election. So when the head of Shabak gets up and says, this rhetoric is going to lead to violence, kind of basically does something unusual, makes a national message and a warning, right? It's clear that he's making references to Rabin's assassination and that we are in one of those moments. How do you, I'm going to ask both of you, how do you hear that, and what goes through your mind at a time like this? Thair?
I mean, first and foremost, it kind of proves that we haven't learned anything over the last 25 years, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. It is not surprising, though, I must have to say, there is this environment in Israel which is very poisonous. Now, Israeli political debates within Israel have always been, I don't know, I guess you can say tenuous. There's always been, this aggressive tone, let's say, to political debates in Israel, but it has never been anything similar to what I have been watching for the last, few years. And I have read a little bit about Israeli history and researched it. And, some people will go back to like the election of 1981, where, tomatoes were thrown at Shimon Peres, or, people calling Menachem Begin a Nazi in the 1960s and 70s and whatnot. But not even despite all of those bad episodes. The environment in Israel has been very, very poisonous. It has also, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there is no real ideological debate in Israel today, which is a big problem. The debate is over personas. We're talking about, are you for Bibi or against Bibi? And when it kind of takes this tribal dynamic, and people are reinforced within tribal borders instead of, talking ideology and trying to find compromise, then it makes it a lot easier for things to happen. I would also connect this to another issue, which I wish I had time to talk about a little bit more, because it's something that I feel is happening, and I know Amir also agrees with me, but there is this general feeling in Israel of disintegration of state institutions within Israel itself, that over the last 10, 15 years, but particularly over the last 10 years, there's this feeling that the state itself is disintegrating from within. You can definitely feel that in the Arab community in Israel, for example, where we've been having this pandemic of violence going on, and in the last 10 years, it has skyrocketed. In 2010, for example, we had 40 Arab citizens, both inside Israel and East Jerusalem, that were killed due to internal violence within our community. By 2020, that number has reached 105 or 106. So it's grown to over 250% in the last decade alone inside Israel. This doesn't come by chance. We have not had a head of a police. Imagine a country like Israel did not have a head of police for over 2 years. And now the head of the police is actually somebody who was head of the border patrol, which at the end of the day is a military unit. 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago, we had the biggest civilian disaster in the history of the state of Israel, and yet no committee, no investigative committee was established. Just think about how ludicrous that is, having the biggest, it was a stampede in Har Miron. I'm pretty sure you've all heard about it. 45 people are killed, and yet no investigative committee to understand what happened. Not only that, the people who are supposed to represent the victims, meaning the leadership of the ultra-Orthodox community, are the ones who are preventing the committee from being established to begin with. This all comes back, this all leads to this environment, this poisonous environment that we're talking about. There's this disintegration of state institutions, so there's nobody to keep the boundaries or the borders of Israeli democracy to function the way it's supposed to function. And when you bring in this, this tribal divide / this lack of ideological debate, that only creates a more poisonous atmosphere. And I'm really, really worried about what the next few days are going to bring us. I mean, some children, just think about this. So one of the ways they're trying to pressure Naftali Bennett is by going after the children of some of the members of his legislative bloc, the Yamina bloc. So one of the members of that group, her name is Idit Silman, they're following her children, driving them crazy in school. Other members of his bloc, they're also kind of dealing with them in that way. Again, this is all because of this poisonous atmosphere that's created, in my opinion at least, due to the weakening of state institutions.
Thank you for that. Amir? Do you want to add? Because I want to move on to America. I'm gonna move on to America for a moment.
Sadly, agree. And this is the first issue the new government, if it is formed, has to deal with: strengthening these institutions and creating trust from the citizens to these institutions. Because without that trust, what's left basically.
How are you reading what's happening in America? Thair, on the one hand, the Palestinian cause has become a focus in America. For you, Amir, the response to Israel, the negative responses to Zionism in general, the response to the American Jewish community, right, has been severe and concerning. So how are you reading it, right? So here, I'm interested in getting your takes as a person who is, a Palestinian, an Israeli Arab, and an Israeli Jew.
I'll go first quickly. Let Thair address his thing second. But there are three important things that I think we are seeing from the United States during this period. We are seeing, first of all, obviously this very concerning wave of anti-Semitism that exploded together with the fighting in Gaza and the violence inside Israel. And obviously that's not coincidental. This is clearly something that comes together this time. And I think it's very important that President Biden came out strongly against this violence. And I think it's extremely important that people who care about the Palestinian cause and are committed to advancing the Palestinian rights will be the ones to speak up against it. Because what is basically happening here is that the Palestinian issue is being used as an excuse for anti-Semitism and for violence against Jews. And that's something that, first of all, I think obviously is despicable. And frankly, if I had to look at it also from a cynical political place, I think also is harmful to the Palestinian issue in the discourse, because if it becomes affiliated with anti-Semitism in the United States discourse, it will not be good for the Palestinians. Anti-Semitism, I think this is important to take kind of like a step back and look away from the daily incident and the fearful event and the ugly attack. Anti-Semitism is not popular in America. Americans, by and large, don't like anti-Semitism. America, by and large, is not an anti-Semitic country. And I think this is just something that's important to put into perspective. And I also think it's very important for mayors and police leaders, etc., to treat this as any other hate crime and to take it very seriously. And when I was in the United States, I had it fell on me to cover the far-right march in Charlottesville and the massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. I was on the ground physically for both of these events. I think two of the worst anti-Semitic incidents in American history. And I also got to cover other cases of anti-Semitism which were not as severe, but still represent something that again came more from the far left. It was graffiti and throwing a Molotov cocktail at the synagogue and all of these, and there was this anti-Semitic attack on a kosher supermarket in New Jersey in 2019, I think. So I got to see a lot of this. I don't think America overall is represented by this. I really believe the majority of the American public is against it. But it's important to take more steps to actually deal with it. So that's one thing I have to say. The second issue that I think is more of a concern for Israel is the splits we are seeing within the Jewish community around Israel's actions. And this is, in my opinion, a separate issue from the anti-Semitism. I don't see it as, the same level of severity. The anti-Semitic attacks are the worst aspect of what we saw. But this is also something that's important to discuss, and we write about it quite a lot at Haaretz. I had a big story in our Hebrew Friday edition last week. This is something that's, we see the change. We see the change in the American Jewish community, the growing criticism, a sense of disappointment or alienation. And I think that the way to deal with it, well, some of it obviously is at the end of the day policy decisions. But there's also a level here of dialogue and respect that I think has gone completely in the wrong direction. And when our own former ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, says publicly that we basically need to give up on the majority of American Jews and only focus on evangelical Christians, I don't think this helps us deal with the issue. And the last thing I want to say is just on the political level. It was very important to see the split within the Democratic Party with the mostly younger members of Congress and Bernie Sanders as their old leader, taking this very harsh line against Israel. And on the other hand, President Biden coming forward with strong support for Israel, rejecting these calls to limit security assistance to Israel, announcing immediately after the fighting that he's going to replenish the Iron Dome batteries, which is important not for Gaza. Let's be honest. This is important for Hezbollah in the north, because everything that Hamas fired at Israel, Hezbollah has 10 times more. And so when Biden announces, basically one day after the fighting, not because of an Israeli request, but out of his initiative, that he's going to replenish the Iron Dome batteries, this is what it's about. In between these two, kind of polar ends of the Democratic Party, Biden on the one hand and AOC Bernie, what is really important and what Israel needs to be focused on and worried about is staunchly pro-Israel members of Congress, like Bob Menendez, senator from New Jersey, like Jerry Nadler from New York, Ted Deutsch from Florida, people who are friends of Israel and have supported Israel for decades, suddenly speaking up in a new voice and saying that they are concerned with what is happening, that they have that they want clarifications from the Israeli side for all kinds of actions. I'm not going to go into the specific examples. In the battle between Biden and Bernie, Biden has the stronger hand right now. I'm not concerned so much about the Bernie Sanders wing. But if people like Menendez and Nadler are becoming more critical of Israel, this is what we would say red alert. Tseva Adom is how the siren we have here for rocket launches from Gaza. This is a red alert for the US-Israel relationship. We need to understand what is happening and treat it seriously. And again, for that, we need, first of all, a functioning government.
Thank you. Thair.
A few issues. Obviously, I agree with Amir, especially on the anti-Semitism issue, and I think that it's especially important for the Palestinian American community and the Arab American community to have a clear voice. I don't think their voice was clear enough on this issue. It's not just enough to write a few tweets on Twitter saying anti-Semitism is bad. I actually think they had a very positive role following the massacre in Pittsburgh, for example, the Muslim American community in general. So I think they should have a similar voice when it comes to anti-Semitic attacks. Two main things that I want to talk about here. First of all, from a Palestinian perspective, and particularly Palestinian elites, probably the U.S. during this war was one of the things that was highlighted as a positive change, that there's this general feeling amongst Palestinian elites that for the first time, the United States is trying to be a little bit more neutral, if neutral is probably the word, not the best word here, but without a doubt, Bob Menendez particularly was a name that was brought up a lot in Palestinian media. Chuck Schumer, obviously. Chuck Schumer came out from day one and said, I have nothing to do with this and I'm against this completely, which was highlighted in the media. Andrew Yang, the candidate for mayor of New York, who came out in a very strong pro-Israel stance and then a week or two later backtracked, was also something that was highlighted a lot. So in that sense, Israel is facing a very serious challenge, in my opinion. Israel's secret weapon, so to speak, is not in Dimona. It is the bipartisan support for Israel in the United States. And if that is somehow weakening, then that is a huge strategic blow to Israel. And here I'll be very clear. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is the main person to blame for this. Not the only one, because there are changes that are happening in the United States that not even Netanyahu can control. But I think Netanyahu particularly holds most of the blame here, even though this is supposed to be, his own game, diplomacy, right? He's supposed to be Mr. Hasbara. But the fact that Netanyahu over the last 12 years has totally taken sides within the American debate, Republicans over Democrats, evangelicals over Jews, et cetera, has come back to bite Israel, so to speak. It was very clear that the way he's treating Barack Obama is going to come back and hurt Israel strategically, because at the end of the day, Obama is a very popular figure in the Democratic Party, and that kind of helped legitimize the Palestinian cause in many democratic circles more and more. I think the fact that Trump came out in support of Israel in the very, clear-cut way that he did also kind of hurt Israel, because Trump at the end of the day is hated by a large portion of the American public. So if Trump is extremely pro-Israel, that kind of makes the other side all of a sudden look more acceptable towards those that that hate Trump. But I'd also say that the changing religious atmosphere in Israel or landscape in Israel, and probably here, Rabbi, you know a lot more than I do on this issue, but the fact that Israel is becoming much more of a nationalist Orthodox nation is that over the, you know, the relationship with conservative and reform movements in the United States has gone downhill quite a lot. There's been a lot of incitement, particularly against Reform Jews, but also against conservatives, but mainly against Reform, you know, equating them to dogs and whatnot. Some clear anti-Semitic incitement within Israel, within coalition partners of Benjamin Netanyahu. And remember, if Netanyahu somehow is going to get a government, it's going to be a government of 61. So he's going to be dependent on these people. That doesn't really help Israel's case in the Jewish community. In that sense, I can definitely understand, particularly younger Jews, why they are finding Israel to be less and less attractive compared to their parents. So Israel really needs to change. I mean, fine, it's an Orthodox nation, that's fine, but it has to find a way where it can open itself towards the rest of the Jewish community, particularly in North America. And it needs to go back to a policy where it sees its interests within America, not one group of Americans. So these are the two issues that any future Israeli government are going to have to deal with. American Jews and trying to bring back conservative and reform communities, and also the Democratic Party in the United States.
I didn't expect you to go in that direction of talking as a strong advocate of the non-Orthodox community. So, Thair, I thank you for that. And
if I may, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a member of a minority community, so I have a vested interest personally that all minorities in Israel would be treated equally. But and I mean, it's quite clear where we're going if this does not stop. So that's it.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you both. This has just been a remarkable privilege for all of us to hear your thoughts and to really be enriched by your insights. I hope that we'll be able to do this again. And I hope that when we get to the end of this coming week, that we will be again pleasantly surprised by the response in Israel and the way forward. Whatever the decisions that are made and however this plays out, one only hopes that there will be peace and that things will be done peacefully and in a democratic way. Thank you both very much for your time and for all of your efforts. We applaud you, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rabbi, and to Thair, and to Amy, and to everyone who joined. It's a pleasure to see you all again.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you, gentlemen.